Change is gonna come. Change is gonna come. Have you ever wondered? Have you ever seen it? Does it need to happen for you to believe it? What about the oceans? What about the children? What about the grasslands? What about the mountains?
I'm a big advocate of Indigenous value systems, which is, I think, the most important and often overlooked part of agriculture. And so on that note, just want to say thank you to Magdalena Magazine for having me here, because, you know, if we're going to recruit people to this mission to regenerate this planet, then we're going to need to enter into the world of culture in a big way. And most of the magazines you see out there on the newsstands are not talking about grazing and traditional ecological knowledge and saving seeds. And that's why $40, I think, is a wonderful contribution to make towards somebody going out there trying to. I'm also on the cover, but it has nothing to do with me. Honestly, I just really want Magdalena to sell all these magazines so we can have a new cover star to be on the next panel. But yes, it's really important to support the people who are making moves in the world of culture, because if we're going to reach as many people in a short time as possible, then we need to be infiltrating the magazines, the movies, music, and so I think all those pieces are also important when we talk about regenerative agriculture.
With that, thank you for coming. Thank you for making yourself part of this sacred geometry in this room. There's a constellation of souls that would not have put themselves together in a room other than the fact that there was an inclination, there was an intuition that you wanted to be in this group. Maybe it was to see somebody on the panel, maybe it was because you had a sense that the subject matter was critical to your next steps and the consolidation of who you are and what you're here. But nonetheless, you got here. And the constellation of souls that are up here on the stage have never been together. And I'm excited to be with each of you. And excited to turn back to each of you with a little bit of thought process perhaps around what regeneration has come to mean for you, because it's a term that remains very poorly defined by governments on down to farmers. There seems to be very little consensus, and in some ways that's a relief, because I think it inherently calls for a place-based and specific, plasticity to its nature as a definition. And so I love watching the color of this word come into people's lives and through people's lives. So let's hear a little bit of that color through each of you. Let's hear you, Michelle, for Magdalena. Tell us what that term has come to mean as a journalist and as a photographer and somebody who presents beauty.
I think for me it's like this potential. And recently I saw a Puma ad and I got really triggered, and they're calling themselves the Regeneration. I'm like, is this greenwashing? I almost tagged you in that. I was like, is this greenwashing? And because I think it's really important to define, and especially for ourselves. But if you're thinking about, like, I liked actually that they incorporated the word generation, because I feel like this is the time. And it's really like, this is it. It's a very special time to be alive and to just reconnect after centuries of destruction and mind control and trauma in all around the world. Like, there's nothing like the planet and the earth and nature to really like revive us and regenerate us and connect us. So for me, I also think of like the mycelium network and just the connection of all of us, and like the light coming on in our connection.
Really cool.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Zach. Regeneration. Well, I came to this work of regeneration through holistic management and by the work of Alan Savory. And recently in the organization of the Savory Institute of Holistic Management, there's the conversation amongst practitioners around the world, hubs of practitioners working with holistic management with livestock, working to mimic nature's patterns of how nature's herds organically are part of this system of regeneration, primarily on grasslands, but livestock can subsist in many different types of ecotones. The conversation in holistic management right now is, what is regeneration? And there is no definition. And I always get a little bit, there's these words that get totally just eaten up and used in all kinds of ways, and holistic has been one of those words, although the word holistic is so beautiful. But what I try to do when I define what regeneration is how many ways can I define and say what regeneration is without using the word? And that really helps us to think more deeply. What is regeneration? I actually didn't even think that question was going to be asked to me, so I immediately was like, oh, okay. Well, in all honesty, right now, to me, regeneration is personal resilience. Personal resilience. And that is because in order for us to do the world's work, as big or as small, it is so important to take care of oneself. And today on my birthday, I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and it has been a very challenging time for the first time, really intimately experiencing the devastation of natural disasters and recognizing how important our work is, because the call to action has never been so loud. And so I feel, in this time of endurance, waiting for the storms to let up, but celebrating the water that our earth needed, and celebrating the animals that were born over this past fall and winter, I've found myself quite depleted in just taking more and more and more and more of the intensity of what life is, and what interesting impacts we are now really experiencing here, from the heat of the late last year to the immense waters now. I've realized in order to be a fearless leader to my outfit of shepherds in shepherdess land and livestock and my animals, I have to take care of myself. And it all starts with taking care of oneself. And that is, even in light of the immense amount of water, hydration is key. And when I have these cute little 11 deals right here, they're beautiful. Love the wrinkles and love the, But I know that I'm dehydrated when you can see more and more of those lines on my face. And I am reminded that hydration and taking care of myself is going to be what is going to allow me to lead charge in the little ways that I can, and to be front of my herd of animals and my people. Taking care of myself is the example that I need to lead. And so what regeneration to me, I thought maybe I'd be talking about the agricultural piece, but what regeneration means to me is starting with self and learning to listen to what our bodies need, and the hydration and breath. And I'm speaking that all to you because I am reflecting it back to myself. I invite you to all breathe and drink that water, and that to me is what regeneration is at this moment.
Great question, great answers. There's so many ways to go with that one. Just like there's so many ways to be a practitioner of regenerative anything. To me, my take is, heal the land and you heal the people and you heal the land. And there's no separation between the two things, but they happen simultaneously. But I feel like we need to understand the historic baselines of what these landscapes that we interact with were like, and also the cultures from which we come from, and what they were like, and what their roles were in the landscapes that we all come from. as human beings indigenous to this planet, no matter where you come from, all of us have a role to play. And we're made with this incredible biology and these hands and this mind to be stewards. And so I think when we understand that, we go back in time and understand our own history. And we also then go back in time and understand the history of each place that we live and understand the biological potential that's here now and what was expressed in the past. And sometimes it's as simple as just getting out of the way and letting the land recover on its own. Sometimes it's a matter of getting in the way and blocking the flow of water and spreading it out through the landscape and hydrating it. There's a variety of ways to do this, but it's really a game of observation and listening, taking a long time to study and understand where you are, where this place has been, and where you'd like it to go and where it wants to go. And creating a synthesis between the restoration of human culture and restoration of the functional ecosystems that are required to support that. And it's almost like you say with the original math, it's understanding the original math of the landscape and allowing that biotic pump to just come back to life and engage with it. And we're never going to know how to do it perfectly at first. It's taken many cultures, thousands of years to figure out how to appropriately steward the landscapes that they come from. And then, once they do, as a result of their presence, that landscape is more productive and biodiverse and life-promoting than it would be without humans. And so that's our opportunity. That's what we get to do. And that, to me, is what regeneration in my heart means, is generating humanity to a point where we understand our place.
Thank you, Connor. I think that's a perfect segue to how I would answer that question. Because Indigenous people are the blueprint for how we do this. How many of you, show of hands, if you knew that the Amazon was bioengineered by humans? Okay, most people just imagine that it was some random rainforest landscape put there by God or goddess. Well, actually, most of the forests in South America and in Mesoamerica were bioengineered, human-built orchards, food forests. And we have examples of food systems all over this continent, Turtle Island, all of Abya Yala, that have lasted thousands of years. Some, for example, the Milpa agroforestry system, which I'm going to Mexico to learn, has existed for 8,000 years. By comparison, modern food systems that come from Europe that were imposed on this continent have collapsed after 400. So we would be remiss to not mention in that part of the story that this huge interruption to this regenerative pathway that Indigenous people were on in this continent happened with colonization. And part of remembering our true purpose as humans, in my opinion, it is our birthright to be regenerative. A big part of that is going to be the making amends with the Indigenous people who were removed from their lands, who suffered genocide, and with the loss of them and their languages and their cultures, we also lost thousands of years of observation of the natural landscape. We lost critical climate data that we desperately need now to regenerate the land. And that's why I would say that any definition of regeneration that doesn't include the rematriation of Indigenous people back onto their ancestral lands where possible is not going far enough, in my opinion. Leaving an ecosystem better than when you found it. And so we have wonderful examples of that all around the world. Like I said, some of these food systems have lasted thousands and thousands of years. My ancestors, the Quechua, the Incas, now we're called Quechua, but the Inca empire, built food terraces. They managed to practice agriculture on some land that others would have found completely inhospitable for agriculture. Yet they managed to create ecosystems up in the Andes using terraced farming, using polycultures, and all of these incredible techniques that we call today, we put under the umbrella regenerative agriculture, can be traced back to indigenous cultures in some place around the world. And I do agree with Connor, we are all indigenous to the earth and we are all indigenous to somewhere. And it is such a great shame that so many of us have lost connection with where we're from and with the way that our ancestors were farming and were working with the land. And so I think this is, yeah, I just want to end on that note that okay. I'll end it on that. Thank you.
I love what all of you said. And Connor, when you were speaking to rediscovering our place in the world, currently we have an antagonism towards this being human, that the human is the problem. And I have a very personal battle with that, because this being human is truly the greatest feat, with time being the second one in the cosmic order. And everything that has occurred to pull the human away from its true self, to turn our face away from the great self to the small self, away from the original mathematics to a random chaos of zeros and ones. And so an anthropocentric perspective that understands the position and the role of the human being not as a dominator, but as a steward in service, that requires consciousness. And I, through my studies and observation, have discovered that the indigenous cultures from around the world, whether they be the native First Nations to the Indians, the Persians, the Africans, they were connected to the true self in such a way that allowed for the vertical reception of knowledge and stewardship to be unfurled and translated into the horizontal plane of stewardship. And I'm not the only one saying that, and my memory isn't what it used to be, so I have to pull this up on my phone. But the former head of the United Nations Development Program, Gustav Speff, said this: I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. That's my definition of regeneration.
Yeah.
This is why governments have had a really challenging time defining regeneration. And so, it does delight me that it's so difficult, and we could go around the entire audience and we would get a different and equally beautiful description of what regeneration is to you. And it affects all areas, and this is one of the reasons I think to start in this space and having everybody define it, because obviously not everybody is farming directly or having that direct soil interaction. And so it's important that we all realize that every aspect of human behavior has a choice to act by this connected indigenous stewardship mentality, or to see the world as in a state of scarcity and behave in that kind of egoic fear that we won't have enough, or guilt or shame that we've taken more than we deserve, and that kind of vicious victim-perpetrator coin keeps flipping in human history. And for every time we've been victim, we will flip to become the perpetrator. And you can see that through the rise and fall of empires over history, and you can certainly see it in the day-to-day activities with any group of people, be it a small family or a cultural group or something like a business. You'll see those patterns repeat. But I think that we did see a string start to come together despite the many different lenses we saw that word through, and the word connected keeps coming up. The word stewardship comes up multiple times, and I think different versions of the word healing keep coming up. Self-correction, self-care, self-healing keep coming up, and then this concept of wisdom it sneaks in through our words of indigenous as well. So all of these kind of concepts seem to be batted around when we start to think about regeneration. And the thing that I come away from in traveling broadly around the world right now to see different cultures interpreting these things seem to revolve around those 4 words, but I really appreciate the last quote a lot in that we recognize that the planet, nor the soil, nor the water, nor the air needs to be saved. These are self-correcting systems that have been correcting through cataclysmic changes throughout history. Cataclysmic change is much greater than humans have inflicted upon this Earth's surface. That famous extinction with the dinosaurs was an instantaneous covering of the Earth with a layer of dust that choked out topsoils within a few hours or days, not a few decades as we've done. So it's interesting that biology not only is resilient, it loves the challenge. It can't wait for the next injury because it gets better every time. And your body does this as well. Human biology is designed to get stronger, not weaker, with every trauma. The exceptions to those rules seem to be when we don't take time to heal. And so it's when we start to identify with our injury that we fail to have time to repair. And so if you choose to take on the identity of I am the trauma, I am the traumatizer, I am the cancer on the planet, or everybody else around me is traumatizing me and sucking the life out of me, and that starts to become our identity, there's no place for the healing to occur, because the vibration of the injury has become the reality. And this is where we are now stuck as a humanity in a moment where we are so frustrated at one another, and there's so much polarized finger pointing and judgment towards who did this, who's been apathetic, who's been lazy, who's been intentional to destroy the world. And we're not taking time to let the healing begin. And then one of my favorite bodies of knowledge that has ever downloaded in the last 100 years was certainly that Course in Miracles in the 1960s. And that conclusion of that massive tome of work is that the last thing that I will do in this human body is let go of judgment. And so in some ways, my definition for regeneration has become the moment we let go of judgment. And in that moment, we will begin a healing process that will be so deep and profound that we will actually forget that the injuries ever occurred. And there is a term in medicine that has had to be coined in recent years because it's very awkward to write into a medical chart the word miracle. There's no medical code for miracle, so you can't charge for the miracle. So we had to come up with a different code that sounded like maybe we were responsible in some way, so we could code and therefore bill for a miracle. And so we used the term spontaneous remission, which sounds super technical. Spontaneous remission is so ridiculous to witness that it really does defy everything that a physician has ever been taught, and therefore we have to have massive layers of denial that this thing actually occurs. And so we put a CPT code of spontaneous remission, and we reassure ourselves like that was strange, but that's not normal. Everything else is normal. Everything else is normal, that's not normal. That was an exception to the rules. When spontaneous remission happens, you have somebody with stage 4 cancer riddled with lungs and brain with tumors that have metastasized from some colon or breast cancer. When that spontaneous remission happens, it happens so fast that the person wakes up simply feeling better, feeling like they're 10 years younger, and decades of decline suddenly are gone. And they call up their doc a couple days later, and they're like, yeah, I'm feeling like super good. And the headaches are gone, and my slurred speech is gone, and I just feel really great. I feel fantastic. And the doctor's like, well, sometimes that happens right before you die, you gotta get that surge, and so you're probably almost dead, so come on in, hurry up. And so let's scan you real quick. And doggone it, that CT scan shows nothing. Meaning, not only are all the tumors gone, there is no scar tissue where the tumors were, there's only the remembrance of who you used to be, and it appears again. That's spontaneous remission. Those moments come in hospice more often than doctors would like to admit, where suddenly everything is back to its original order. And so we have an opportunity to take a pause and lose judgment on one another long enough that the healing and perhaps even the spontaneous remission of the human condition can resolve itself, or to appear from out of the nowhere that it comes from, or returning us as a species to our original map. And so that's where we're at right now. We're at our moment. We have a choice. So I think we're going to go ahead and open this up, because what I was most excited about driving up to Ojai today was hear from all of you. So I'm going to see if I got the vibration in a voice that is reflective of the actual tuning of your DNA. You're a column of water. You have 70 trillion cells with very specific antennae in there that we call DNA. And every single human has a slight variation on the expression of that antenna, and it vibrates in a complete and constant cosmic concussion of vibrations that are coming from every star in the universe, and it's hitting every one of us. The same information is hitting every one of us, but we're receiving it differently. And that is what gives you your self-identity. You've never woken up thinking you're me. I've never woken up thinking I'm you, because my antennae are tuned to my station. Your voice is this awesome expression of that original vibration, your unique vibration. And for many of us, including myself, I didn't know what my voice sounded like. My voice has changed over the last 10 years as I started to find it. And I realized I was playing a role in life as a doctor, as a dad, as a husband, as a church-going guy, all the things. I was playing so many roles, I didn't even know what my own voice sounded like, because I wasn't actually tuned to my station yet. And so practice finding your voice and that original vibration. This guy's got his.
Thank you, thank you. So just some thoughts on the presentations, and thanks for all of the unique and independent presentations there, because it was just so rich and so inspiring. I just wanted to point out something that happened last week. I went to college in the Northwest, and the salmon are so important to the indigenous people of the Northwest. And the powers that be and the U.S. government and fisheries management closed the salmon fisheries for the entire west coast of the United States last week. And I'm reading this, and most of the articles about the jobs that were lost, the 10,000 fishermen that didn't have jobs. But there was no other commentary about the downstream biology of the impact of the salmon basically not returning to the west coast of the United States this year. And it just a stark blindness in the narrative around this concept. I was on an airplane a couple of months ago, and I was watching the Patagonia series of films, which is fantastic. And one of the films was called Artificial, and it was about fish farming on the west coast of the United States and in Norway. And it was so incredible, because it really graphically displayed this symmetrical relationship that human beings have with nature that we're describing today and here, as opposed to an asymmetrical relationship we think we have as a domineering force above nature. In fact, we're involved with it, we're in the biosphere, we're in a relationship with it, and we move these elements around, we destroy that symmetrical relationship. But I just wanted the panel to comment about this notion of the fish being gone. And the other thing that was displayed graphically in this Patagonia film was that the dams that were built in the west coast of the United States in the last century, and then the management of the fish and the salmon was handed over to the Department of Agriculture, agribusiness, not biologists. It was handed over to agriculturalists. And so they looked at fish farming and fish hatcheries as agriculture. And in all the cases where these dams are taken down and nature has handed back the salmon runs, they return in a short period of time. When Mount St. Helens blew up and blocked all the rivers in the area, and they basically just had to let the salmon regenerate, it was 6 years, and those salmon were back in force, and it was absolutely incredible. And so this notion of turning biology back to itself, challenging it, and let it regenerate, I just think that's a profound example of it. Now, with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Todd, do you want to take that one? I feel like that's applicable to some of your observations with the water and all this.
Sure. Yeah, I actually just heard about the closure of the salmon fisheries yesterday, which is probably an appropriate response. And it's interesting how, humans are often self-interested, or at least not always, that doesn't necessarily mean a negative thing too, but they're paying attention to the job losses, how are we going to take care of these people who were employed by this beautiful fishery. And I would like to be a part of a culture that pays attention to a bigger story unfolding there too. It's like, oh, maybe we pivot from what they were doing before to do restoration work higher up in the watershed to make better spawning environments. And so there's all kinds of ways to play with those pivots when we're trying to contend with nature's changes. But yeah, the ability for those indicator species to rebound is, I remember watching the Mount St. Helens documentary when I was a kid and thinking, holy smokes, like, nature is so resilient, and I'm that. And so I've always had so much faith, and I've never really despaired that much. I know that the Earth's going to be fine. It's really about how we enjoy our time here. She's a, self-regulating meta-organism, so it's going to be okay. But one thing that really was what I was really excited about this fall was I was talking to a local fisherman friend of mine who is also a beer brewer, and I was getting the beer mash from his brewery to bring to my pigs and chickens, and we always have interesting conversations when loading those bins up. And he was saying that I want to say it was October or November, there's a forum of fishermen that communicate with each other from the Point Mugu Naval Base to Emma Wood State Beach. And there were somewhere in the number of like 12 to 15 20-inch steelhead trout caught in the surf during those 2 months, which you never hear about that. And also, simultaneously, we had the biggest acorn drop that's been recorded in the last, I want to say 20, 25 years. But all the predictions for what was going to happen this winter said it was going to be dry and mild.
It's about letting indigenous people steward these quote-unquote resources again, letting them return to be the stewards of these relatives of theirs, and stop looking at this beautiful species like a commodity. I mean, I can't imagine going back in a time machine 500 years and trying to tell an indigenous tribe how we were going to treat their relatives in the future. That they would be commercially farmed or overfished, and like I said, frozen and shipped halfway across the world for people who don't even live in these regions to eat. And so this is my big problem with the globalization, that, we are, and this can only happen because of globalization. I don't want to go on a tangent, but there's a big argument for saying in order for the salmon to regenerate, only the people who are fishing the salmon or living in those areas should be able to eat them. And others who are not in regions where salmon is abundant should say, I'm going to sit this one out for a few generations so that we don't deplete them for future ones. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Sycamore. I'm a permaculture gardener, farm-to-table chef, and I teach at the Culinary Institute, trying to teach chefs that there are a better option for food. And my question is about that choice element. When you spoke about water, my question is on water. I'm wondering if you all can speak more about how, as Connor says, drought is a choice. How are we choosing to be in this crisis right now? And how can we give each other examples for how this is possible? My partner helps people get hydrated in their body. And when they feel hydrated in their body, they know that there's a better option, and then they choose that. When they go see Connor's Pond, they're like, wow, we don't have to have a dry Ventura River. We can actually hold water. There's a choice. So I'm curious about and the same with fashion. When we see that you can be beautiful and have all of these fabrics and still dress exquisitely, look, this is a choice I can make. And then with the land, I mean, to actually see the way these hooved relatives move across the land and to see the way it improves it, for me, there's a gap right now in that people actually can't imagine a better future. The parasitism of the climate change narrative right now, in that we are a cancer on the earth, that we have to limit ourselves, that humans are evil. Like, could any of you speak to how we're choosing to be in a dystopian, apocalyptic mindset when actually, given the free choice and given the examples, we can actually choose a completely regenerated planet and culture?
Out on the animals in the water.
Well, I wanted to say that what Hoda said about that last quote, a culture of care requires us to be engaged with what is around us, right? And I immediately thought, okay, how do folks know how to be proactive in solutions, especially around water? Well, experiencing beautiful water in places where water has not been flourishing, like going to Connor's spot. The experience is really important, and I am so excited to say, after 3 days of a lot of work, thank you, shepherds, we moved over 600 animals right off of the I-5 around the hillsides of Six Flags Magic Mountain, and over, guessing 2 million people a week are going to be able to see our livestock grazing in a nature preserve. Beautiful grass, thank you. I'm very stoked on that. I think that those people seeing those animals on a hillside asking, why are they there? What are those? Is that a sheep or a goat? Though asking those questions, beginning that conversation, folks stopping and pulling off the side of the road to talk to the shepherd who, these guys are real busy. We're real busy building fence and such, but I think we all are really joyful to have these conversations with folks. So I think the more that folks like us are out there, thank you so much, Nat, for all of the work that you do with, speaking to so many people. I think that the more we can demonstrate our personal action, the better. We just need to see it out there, and we need to support that culture of care.
It's beautiful. I would really emphasize your message of story there, that we're missing the vision of where we could be. And Farmers Footprint, our nonprofit that we've been running for the last few years, we stumbled upon a quote, and it looks like it's actually been attributed to a number of people over time, so I don't know who said it first, but humans are not made of cells, but we are made of stories. And I think that's such a powerful realization, is that our creative capacity as some sort of element, high vibration element of the divine, creates what we think, creates the story we tell. And so when we do get locked in these identities as the traumatized or identities as the wound, we do perpetuate that phenomenon of the cancer. But one thing I'd say about the cancer story that's interesting is we also have judgment about our concept of the word cancer. We think it's a bad thing. So the idea that we are a cancer is actually super accurate by the biology that we're pulling out. We've failed to produce our own energy as a system, as an empire or a system of empires. And so we extract from the region around us. The reason we can no longer produce enough energy to sustain ourselves is because of an accumulation of injury due to that failure to heal, because we keep identifying with the old story. And so cancer, it turns out, as an old chemotherapy guy, I can tell you that the cancer cell is the most damaged cell in the body. And so we have the industry wants you to believe it's this bad thing that's attacking you, but in fact it's the most injured and lonely cell in your body. The average cancer cell has 20,000 unrepaired genetic injuries in it, which is kind of dramatic because we only have 19,800 genes. Meaning that you have to accumulate the equivalent of an error in every single gene of that cell before it can become a cancer cell. And so when we say that we are the cancer on the planet, it's not that we're some awful thing happening to the planet. It's just that we're the most isolated and most accumulated injury of any other cell on the planet.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I work part of the Regenerate Ojai group of people. As I know, Connor has been a big part of the conversation and one of the executive producers of the Regenerate Ojai film. And I want to ask you, and of course, I'd love for Connor to elaborate on this. There's so much resistance from the farmers and a polarization that has happened between the farmers and the concerned community members and the people on the kind of task force or the pro-activists, and there's been op-ed articles written on, you know, Josh and Rebecca Kelley, who are the filmmakers and super incredible activists in the community and worldwide. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts, advice, you know, inspiration or words of encouragement just in terms of bridging the gap of just this polarization between the farmers and, you know, and us versus them in terms of the conversation or the solutions. And
Any of you want to add to this and jump in? But my thoughts on that is we've seen this since the very beginning of the Farmer's Footprint journey, in that we are stepping into a space as like the new kid on the block of groups of people or organizations saying that human health equals soil health. The difference that we took it from was simply telling the story from the farmer's angle instead of telling it from the scientist's angle, which I set out to do. When I first started making the Farmer's Footprint documentary, I was traveling from the north headwaters of the Mississippi down to the mouth of Mississippi, and I was going to tell the story of the cancer accumulating along that thing, and Cancer Alley, last 90 miles of the river, highest rates of cancer in the whole world. And nobody was talking about this. They couldn't believe that we had all this data, and nobody was putting that together. So I set out to tell the scientific journey, and my world collapsed and began its reformation in the very first farm that we spent time up in Minnesota. And what we were realizing was that this farmer had absolutely no choice in their behavior, that they had been trapped so thoroughly by a system that had so intricately been put together to force a behavior from them. And here we were as activists wanting to tell them they were doing the wrong thing. And they set up this whole system of denial and protection and defensiveness that's necessary when you're being attacked from a completely indefensible position ultimately. And so I think as activists, it's important that we let go of activism as a concept and start to think about regeneration, which is connection. And so we got to start reach across to that farmer and go sit with them in the barn that's full of chemicals and start to imagine the new narrative with them. And we have to tell the story from there. And now that we've done that, over the last 5 years, we're now trying to solve for the greater issue of why isn't regeneration universal. It's because the whole ecosystem around the farmer was set into motion with a specific effort to sell more chemicals. And so the USDA crop insurance, that is basically a welfare system that can only be doled out to farmers that are using chemical and conventional agricultural practices, and they can't get a bank loan for their inputs or their seed if they don't have USDA crop insurance. So these are the subtle things that are not very subtle that have trapped the farmer into these behaviors. So I think as activists and as communities, we're going to have to realize, okay, we're going to have to immediately reimagine the entire landscape. And the way to overcome those problems is ultimately reconnection, which is to say regeneration. And so when we connect the farmer directly to the consumer, you bypass the USDA, crop insurance people, everything else. And so it's really by rediscovering self within the context of community that the farmer and the consumer, I think, will bridge those gaps and will end the polarization. But it is very frightening as a farmer when you're told you're doing the wrong thing and you're killing the planet because your kid has autism and your kid has cancer. The first lecture I gave in a farm field went until like 10:30 at night in the dark in a farm field with a monitor that was running off a generator. And I was showing all the data of our laboratory, showing these farmers in the middle of huge cornfields that their chemicals were causing cancer and autism and all this stuff. And you cannot imagine the tears that were running that night in these families that realized they were doing this to themselves and their children and their grandchildren and every child downstream of them. It's too much of a karmic burden to put on an individual. they have to go into severe denial, severe self-defense to even survive the day when they find the truth out. And so we need to scoop these people up and acknowledge we all did this. Y'all are doing chemical farming because we stopped gardening. We stopped growing our own food. We told somebody else to do it. It was much easier just to buy it off a grocery store shelf. So we created the trap unintentionally by our pursuit of convenience. And this has created a system that has trapped some that look like perpetrators but are actually probably the victims. And we all need to get out of the perpetrator-victim mode and become creators.
Thank you. Just before you come on, I'd like to speak with that because we're working together in Chai, we're working together with both local farmers, a particular farmer and farm up in Goleta for growing our inputs, who is using regenerative farming processes, as well as creating the most spectacular compost, whose microbiome of this compost is essentially the fertile foundation for being able to grow food that carries that information and inputs that carries that information. For example, like the ashwagandha that we grow and use in our products, right? And we're already 100% organic, but we're trying to make our supply chain 100% regenerative. That's working together with farmers around the globe because we can't get cacao here, for example, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is because, just like you said, the choices that we make, even though economically in that moment it means we can't have 5 Hershey's bars, but we can have one of these regenerative snacks or this regenerative drink, we are creating incremental changes in the entire system, and it's allowing for us to become essentially sovereign in our supply chain, in our food chain. So working together with local farmers, working together with local makers and companies who are then providing foods that are actual nourishments for not only our bodies, but the body of Mother Earth. So we're part of that change and shifting that. So I wanted to bring that in to that.
Thank you so much for what you just said. That was kind of my question and answer that I was going to preface, but I really appreciate it. My name is Lauren Leidyke. I grew up in Ojai. I went to this junior high. And yeah, so I'm a permaculture designer, arborist, and have managed citrus orchards in the valley. So I wanted to address that first because I saw the movie. I thought it was very well done. It had a lot of really, convincing data. However, I felt that it still was demonizing farmers. And I think that's a short way of what you just said, is that we kind of have to move beyond this demonization of farmers because they are trying to feed people. They're not really trying to destroy the planet. They're caught in a vicious cycle. So how can we incentivize farmers to adopt regenerative practices as opposed to saying you're bad, what you're doing is destroying the earth? They've heard that message for 30 years. So how can we incentivize farmers to switch to regenerative and organic practices? So if you've ever been a citrus farmer, the packing houses won't buy your citrus unless it's sprayed. So who's imposing the regulations on the farmer? If the farmer doesn't spray for ACP, Asian citrus psyllid, they can't sell their fruit. So they're trapped. Also, the consumer demands a certain quality of fruit. Perfect fruit. And if not, you actually have to pay to get your fruit picked. Sunkist charges you 20 cents to pick fruit, but they'll pay you 10 cents for it because it's juice grade. So the farmers are stuck in this vicious cycle where they can't sell their fruit unless it's sprayed and huge and perfect. That means a lot of water. So that is kind of coupled with this. There's no local packing houses. So I know there's enough money in this valley to create a local packing house that would buy unsprayed fruit. And that could be a win-win because we could have a direct-to-consumer Ojai Ojai. I'm going to trademark that. We got organic oranges from Ojai Valley. We're incentivizing farmers. We only buy unsprayed fruit. We preferentially buy fruit that is from orchards that integrate animals into the system, that integrate cover cropping, that are starting to diversify with agroforestry practices. We can incentivize this. And so we have to switch our mindset to create the conditions for regeneration. Because nature is already regenerative, and we have the skills and the mindset to create the conditions for regeneration to happen. I wasn't planning on making a speech, but I also wanted to suggest that you asked a really good question, what is regeneration? So I wanted to ask you what you thought about Rodale's definition, because Rodale has a regenerative organic certification that's been, my mic is losing volume. This regenerative organic certification I drafted the first draft of it, and so it has 3 legs of the stool: economic, ecological, and social. Those are the 3 facets of regeneration. All in a regenerative system creates more resources than it consumes. And that's a natural system. That's the soundbite. A regenerative system creates more resources than it consumes. And nature on its own does that, but we can actually up that. We can actually create synergistic effects by connecting the dots and creating beneficial relationships. And then the cancer of society will be reduced because we're creating connections.
Wow, thank you so much for the invitation to talk about the importance of localization. So I was really touched by listening to the perspective of the farmer feeling demonized, and it has been easy to point fingers at them and say, you're doing it wrong and this is why we're sick. But let's step back a little bit and look from a more macro perspective. Who is mandating that the farmers do this? It's the transnational corporations. It's a globalized trade system that we inherited from colonization. When the settlers first came here, there were diversified local food systems across this whole continent. Yes, there was trade, but there was local resilience everywhere. And one of the most devastating things that they have done on an ecological level, on a community level, was wipe out all these wonderful, diverse, human-managed ecosystems and agricultural systems and say, right, this doesn't make money for us, this is useless, so you plant cacao, you plant tobacco, you plant bananas, and this is all going to make us rich in this new globalized food trade system. And so if we can also replace the villain of the story to not individuals and individual farmers, but a system.
This is similar to the farmer situation where we see the farmer spraying crops and we see that they're making a silly decision and all this, and we come up with a very reductionist viewpoint on what's wrong and what needs to be corrected. And it's very easy to perpetrate the same process when we think about an indigenous culture and peoples that are still living on the lands that they historically had been on, at least to some degree. But we have to remember that most of them actually aren't on the lands that they originally were on because they were displaced and they were stopped from their original migration patterns and everything else. And so we've created a very artificial environment for the places that we call indigenous. And so there's lots of injuries that stack up as we go down. And so it's been interesting for me to travel the world into very indigenous cultures, from Amazon to Africa to First Nations territories within the United States, and recognize that as a colonial history white person with 400 years of my family on North America soil, coming as refugees from Scotch Ireland, where we were dying as a people, coming out of a Celtic background, where my Celtic background were the first to be genocided by the Romans. And so the Roman Empire under Julius Caesar tried to genocide the Celtic culture and peoples. And that became the Scotch Irish then that survived that, and then they became suppressed by the English Empire, who were being literally crushed along with the Welsh and everything else. And so we escaped here. And so it's this victim-perpetrator coin that keeps flipping through history. And the role that I've played, a lot of this is coming to terms with the fact that for the last 400 years, my families and architectures around those families were the ones that were extractive. there was a lot of people in that were actually trying to do the right thing, I think, but so it wasn't, you can't blanket say all the people in my 400 U.S. history were doing the wrong thing. But on the journey, I've realized that my role that can be very potent is just bring an apology. And as a really, really seemingly useless thing in some ways of like, well, it's 400 years and we've destroyed 97% of indigenous cultures and people. What does an apology really, how can I bring an apology that's relevant? And yet every time that it has come, it has been so profound what comes through, not through me, but through the entire community when that space of I am sorry opens up. And so I think we have an opportunity to say I'm sorry. And in that apology, we open up a regenerative moment, again, where we stop identifying with the history of the story and we create that moment, that space where we stop identifying with the story so that the healing can begin. And so in my experience, we all have the opportunity to say I am sorry to one another, but we can all say I am sorry deeply to the earth beneath our feet and to the peoples that we have touched over the years. Recently was part of a regenerative garden system with the Dene people in the Navajo Nation, to find out, as we're sitting there, reflecting in a romanticized Western or recent history story that, they were displaced and they were, taken out, and their elder, who was a 93-year-old woman who was a shepherdess her entire life, starts laughing and she's like, "We're awful. We were awful. We were marauders. We stole from everybody. We took crops from every other tribe in North America. Like, you've got this romanticized views that you came and harmed us. Like, we were ridiculous." And so she's had this sense of humor about her own history. And it really just sobered me of like, I had this deep narrative of they've been the victim, and she didn't want the victim story. She didn't want that identity. She was a shepherdess. She didn't need a victim story as to who she was. So I think it's going to be challenging every time we wade into these spaces, and we are going to make mistakes. I make a mistake every time I open my mouth because I'm coming from one umfeld, one little perceived reality. But if I come with an open heart that says I am sorry, we begin that journey into that healing process, I think. So that'd be a short answer to a very complicated question there.
Thank you. Thank you for the willingness to even feel a sorry in your heart, even though you personally were not responsible for the things that happen on this continent and all around the world. No one here is personally responsible for that. And as an Indigenous person, I do want to say that thank you. As an Indigenous person to this continent, I want to say to those who are descendants of recent settlers and therefore comparatively with time guests, I want to say that we don't want anyone to be living in shame or guilt. We don't want to perpetuate cycles of victim and oppressor. However, what we do want is justice. And for justice to be done, there has to be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And maybe this is so hard for people, and I notice certain people being uncomfortable when I talk, and that's okay. I exist to create tension, because sometimes that's how you get better and grow and heal. But maybe perhaps why this is such an uncomfortable topic for the descendants of the people who settled and colonized these lands is because you guys brought a whole different value system around justice. And it involved a lot of shaming and a lot of just perpetual punishment and ostracization from the group. But Indigenous people have different value systems around justice. I want to share one from Australia that really stuck with me. In Australian Indigenous culture, in one of them in particular, because there were many, when somebody committed a crime in the community, when harm had been done, that person had to acknowledge his crime immediately, and his punishment was harsh and swift, but then it was completely erased and forgotten, and he was welcomed back into the fold of the community. And it encouraged people who had done something wrong to acknowledge the wrongdoing very quickly, receive the punishment or the repercussions in order that they be welcomed back and loved once again. But in this culture, we have a justice system built on shame. Oh, you've done something wrong, we're going to judge you and shame you forever. You have to go to prison, then you have to leave, and then you'll have a criminal record. And I'm trying to introduce a different concept of justice. By saying sorry, by acknowledging that we are on land that was stolen, and by making enormous efforts to be allies to the existing 4% of the population of the world that are indigenous, that are protecting 80% of our biodiversity. That is enough. I'm not trying to make you go home and feel bad. Just acknowledge that the wrongdoing happened and say, how can I show up and be an ally? That is enough, because we all have to get in this, we're all in this together, and we all have to partner now to make a difference and to build a new culture that's not built on this flipping coin of victim, oppressor. Let's create a new paradigm altogether, and let's leave the shame and guilt behind. But first, acknowledgement, and then reparations and repair where possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also just want to open the invitation if anybody is interested in partnering. We will be seeking efforts for truth and reconciliation, and then also help to support the buyback. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm Paige Fay. I'm a journalist, storyteller, and I've spent the last 12 years working in our food systems. And I'm having a bit of a tough day, and I'm seeking connection. So before I ask my question, I'd love a raise of hands for who in their body feels grief for where we are as a species right now. Thank you. I feel more at home. So after spending 12 years in our food systems, and largely for large companies that I don't necessarily align with anymore, and looking deeply at our supply chains, it's become very clear to me that the only way forward is toward moving towards a largely bioregional food system, which will not happen overnight. That is also in large part because while I love things like the regenerative organic certification, I work with and help a lot of the brands that have that certification, simply the cost of food is not tenable given the subsidies in our current industrial agricultural system, and it doesn't support the health of indigenous and low-income people. However, given our largely nomadic culture, where, and I'm included in this, we're all moving and flying from one place to another, how do you all believe that we can start to move towards bioregional food systems and reclaim a sense of place as individuals and communities?
Hi, Paige. Great to see you. Well, that's an amazing question. And as somebody who has a personal epistemology of initially of displacement and exile and war, and then the attempt and to some extent success of integration into various cultures, oftentimes urban, so very detached from nature, and then oftentimes also very deeply immersed in nature, until essentially it was about 6 years ago that I moved to red wine country in Austria. And the village where I was living was about 2,000 people. The language was German, the fifth language I had to learn. And about 3 years ago, I moved to Ojai. About 8,000 population in California. We all know where we are. So how do we create these bioregional food systems? I think part of my answer to it is to understand first the resilience of the human being, and then the ability of the human being, of the nomads, and the host communities, right? Whether that was Britain in the 80s, who was the host community for my political family, who sought asylum there, or the host community of Ojai, who so generously welcomed me into the fold here and supported my attempts through my organization to tie in with the food system here and the community here. I think that communication and that connection and the openness to being able to evolve through how we bring our personal experiences into the collective, especially within a parametered scale, right? This allows us, a place like Ojai, for example, allows us to be able to experiment with bioregional food security and food sovereignty, right? But it also still requires an openness to outside influence, the right kind. And the outsiders, the nomads, need to then have a deep respect for how the internal mechanisms of that culture and that land are also working. As far as the actual agricultural processes required for bioregional food sovereignty, that's more your area of specialization and Farmer Ian's area of specialization with whom I work, so I daren't speak to that. But I think cultural communication and openness to becoming more enriched and working together, no matter where we land, whether it's a village in Austria or in Ojai, I think we can do it. Yeah.
Thank you. One of my favorite and most simple quotes from Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, was that the greatest shift we can make as individuals is one from consumption to production. And it wasn't that long ago that most of us grew food. You know, we only lost that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if we're really stretching. Most of the annual crops were produced in the backyard. And now we've scaled annual production to dominate vast landscapes that were once perennial systems and are destroying them. So I think we need to bring annual production back to our backyards.
I'll be quick because I know in time. I just wanted to speak to bioregional food security. One of the byproducts of our land stewardship with our sheep and goats here, eating our terroir, our ecology around the valley, is right here food production and fiber production as a byproduct of our land stewardship. Bokehouse Hearth and Husbandry was started by my lead shepherd last year, and we are now feeding our valley at the Duchess and Pinion and Roy's Place and direct to consumer animals that were raised and grazed here, and we are eating our ecology through what this beautiful work is producing. So I did want to say it's happening here.
Beautiful. Thank you all for the input and effort to get here and be in this sacred constellation of souls that came together today. I acknowledge that there's a lot of human works that have transpired. There's a lot of energetic exchange at the human level that feels good to receive. But it's always worth noting that all these souls were held in their seats for a period of time to do work together that we can't imagine. And so there's transformative work all the time going on a bigger playing field than we can see with our eyes or sense with our five senses. But I do want to recognize the beauty of humanity in this closing thought, which is there is a lot of talk that we're the problem on the planet, and I feel like I've perpetuated a lot of that talk over the years. And our behavior certainly is the problem, but our potential is not the problem. And so our behavior can radically correct very quickly. And I want to reflect on the fact that the reason we behave as we do is likely because of our five senses. We are uniquely equipped with five senses that give us the capacity to believe or perceive that we're separate from nature. And I believe we're the only species that's ever experienced this. And it's a great gift as much as it became our greatest vulnerability. In the vulnerability, in seeing everything separate from ourselves, it was frightening because we didn't have a sense of why we were here or where we were going perhaps. And so we started methods of responding in a scarcity mentality because we believed ourselves to be separate or rejected from nature. But as soon as we resolve this little fear of being separate and acknowledge that it's simply a perception issue that we are separate and not actually a truth. We really truly are one vibration called Mother Earth, and we are a facet of her beauty. We are a facet of her imagination, and we are emanating with life within us. We are the most complex ecosystem she's ever created. There's more biodiversity in the colon of a human being than any other ecosystem on Earth, and we now understand that that's why we exhibit intelligence, because our neural system taps into that biodiversity And we have 40,000 species of just bacteria, let alone probably 500,000 species of fungi that are capable of directly interacting with our neurologic system. And our CPU chip makes patterns and understandings of that data that makes us intelligent. And so we are intelligent for the biodiversity we carry. And nature has brought us into this opportunity. And when I go to Africa, or you go down to Encinitas and you stand on a cliff at Beacon's Beach or something like that, you will see humans come out in droves at about 5:30 or 6 p.m. to watch sunset. And you will notice the birds never stop to look at sunset. And the monkeys in the African tree never turn to look at the sunset. And yet the humans, 7 billion of us, take a pause and holy smokes, it's so beautiful. We are the only species that watches the sunset. That's interesting. And it speaks to our role within a complex ecosystem. I believe we were given these 5 senses, designed to give us the perception of separateness so that we could see her beauty. And we can heal that wound immediately. It's that slight change in perception of why are we here, and realize it was our 5 senses that gave us the 40,000 journey year that we've had in this last epoch. And those 5 senses can take us back into our right relationship, our right role within nature, when we recognize we were simply put here to see her beauty. You're part of that.
I ask Zach's blessing to share this poem from Rumi that is essentially what Zach said, but from about 900 years ago, in talking about the ontological process that brought existence into being. Rumi says, this is the poetic speech of God, so to speak. I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. And upon the utterance of love, the process of creation began. So that really resonated. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just so grateful for this whole communion that we've had as a community to come together and share our voices. It made me so happy to see the audience participating in this connection and this conversation, because we are all a part of this. And as voices in the community and leaders, it's important that we engage in this way. And I really feel like in that way we're taking the reins and the responsibility for our own participation, and I love to see that. It's super exciting. And I have one more parting gift for you before we wrap up this very special time. I wanted to invite my beautiful friend Shylah Ray to come up and sing a song. She's been a beautiful inspiration for me to keep it wild and sacred and fun. So I wanted to bring Shylah up, and I'm lucky to have. So yeah, I want to thank the panelists, and happy birthday, Cole, and all of these amazing voices that have come.
I'm going to sing to this land, I'm going to sing to this community, sing because I can, because I love it, and I encourage you to find your own voice in it. Into the wild I go, and into the wild I am. It's been a while, freedom time, since I left my roots back home. I once tried to run it away, and I go wild, and I must pray. Running, hiding, I was riding high in the sunset sky. Hey, 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 hey. torch of a light, all in the darkness of the night. Years we fought for this freedom, years I thought I had a wisdom. Now I see with new eyes. From this truth I cannot hide. Hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey. Hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, oh, hey. I gotta believe I'm here to make a difference without fear of being seen or heard. Like a bird who flies at night, like a lion strong and fierce, like a whale singing. I'd like to be bringing peace to you, to me, to you, to me. Into the wild I go, and into the wild I am. It's been a while, freedom child, since I left my roots back home. Into the wild I go, and into the wild I am. It's been a while, freedom child, since I left my roots back home. The song is called Change. I dedicate it to Magdalena, who has just supported me so much and supported this community. I know she doesn't live here. I love how much you love this community and just the good that you want for everybody. We're all here because you helped make this happen, so I love you. Thank you. Fall apart in God's hands. We can try to imagine what life would be like if we aim for perfection, no existence, a dedication to no resistance, no resistance. Like a shadow in the night, see the darkness come to light. We are part of a circle of virtue. See the truth. These are the darkest and heaviest of times. Facing a breakdown, who's gonna gain ground when it's time to decide who's gonna run your life for the good of our people, our faces and races of one truth. We rise, we fall, we find it all inside us. Oh, we're gonna need to let go of this. Oh, despite the illusion, man, there's gonna be better days ahead, just as bright as they've always been. for you to believe it? What about the oceans? What about the children? What about the grasslands? What about the mountains? What about the waters? What about the rivers? What about the seasons? Will we still need them? What about the Indians? What about the Africans? What about Americans? Who's gonna change them? Who's gonna change them? Oh, you're gonna need to let go of this. Oh, this tight grip, and you never shall let no, never gonna be brighter days ahead. Yeah, just as bright as they've always been. Change is gonna come. I said a change is gonna come. Hey, yeah. I said a change is gonna come. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I said a change is gonna come. Ooh, yeah. Couldn't have been possible without it. Thanks so much. It's not over, but we're gonna go over to the farm. We're gonna go to the farm.